Yeah, you're ready to go.
Hello, my name is Daniel Rothbard. I'm professor of conflict analysis and resolution here and director of the master's program. I'm also director of a new program on ethics and conflict, and that's actually what I'm going to talk about in this short segment. Exactly what is ethics and conflict, and why is it so important to our field? Well, in a certain way, this topic is a perspective. It's not a new perspective, but it's a perspective that we often don't think about. But in a way, we do it all the time in analyzing and trying to intervene in conflicts. That is, the mission of ethics and conflict is to provide a certain way of understanding conflicts as a kind of diagnosis, and a certain way of engaging in practice as a kind of treatment of a conflict setting. So first, let me talk about the diagnosis. What we focus on is the way in which the conflict parties intervene when they are in or about to be in a state of crisis. As you know, that in many protracted conflicts, the parties believe that they are facing an existential threat, they are traumatized by long-term suffering, they are subjected to abuses, injustices of many kinds. And this setting, and we see this in so many cases, most recently in the North Africa so-called Arab Spring rebellions, that this kind of setting creates among the conflict parties an extreme kind of reaction. They react in terms of their actions, which obviously can be hostile. They react in terms of their thinking, accusing the other of all sorts of injustices and tyranny, sometimes kind of in a dehumanizing way, thinking of themselves as pure and virtuous. And they react, of course, emotionally. And emotions are a very important part of the parties' reactions. They, of course, fear, they have hostility, hatred among themselves, they feel sympathy, empathy for their in-group members. So this is obvious, of course, in the conflicts of extreme intensity and violence, such as the conflicts of genocide. And now we're seeing it recently, of course, in the tragedy of Syria, which is ongoing as we speak. Now, all of those dimensions of the human response have a moralistic aspect to them. They are morally charged. That is, when people engage in violence, that is an act that is considered immoral by the targeted group, obviously. When a group feels oppressed, they believe they're subject to injustices by the group in power, the so-called haves. Those in power are abusing the power at the expense of the groups that are subjected to it. That these actions are viewed in a normative way as being right when it's actions that we do, that is in-group actions, and wrong when it's actions of the enemy group. Another aspect of normativity comes in their thinking, that the conflict parties, of course, think in polar terms, simple terms of good and bad, that what we do, the in-group, is good, virtuous, pure, adorned by their God or their sacred figure. The out-group, of course, is doing things that are bad, fundamentally bad, that they are born from some degenerate source, or driven to some inherently evil deed, or committed to a strategy of conquest. Again, we see this quite often in the rhetoric of war, and even in the lead-up, in the build-up of war. So that about their thoughts. The emotions also have a normative dimension. That this is a topic that I think deserves much more attention than it has, the topic of moral emotions. Moral emotions include emotions that reflect value commitments of the person. Moral emotion of guilt, of humiliation, of shame. These reflect the sense of a, as it were, lower status, that in feeling guilty, one feels one did something wrong. In humiliation, one feels that one is wronged, as it were, a target of injustice or a false accusation. And shame, of course, is the embarrassment of feeling that one is wrong. Moral emotions play a very large role in understanding the conflict parties. So all of these aspects of the human response to a crisis, that is, moral actions, the normative thoughts, and the moral emotions, all of these comprise what we can call the moral life of the conflict parties. And everybody has a moral life. It is the aspects of one's thoughts, actions, and feelings that reflect fundamental value commitments. This is particularly prominent in the interpretation of conflict parties when they are engaged in violent acts against another, or in the preparation for that. That is, their moral lives are very clearly demonstrated in their, for example, vitriolic hatred of the enemy, in their demand for sacrifice for themselves, is a highly moralistic commitment, and the demand that their colleagues, their peers, sacrifice as well, sacrifice materially or in the form of giving up their own lives. That's a highly strong moral commitment. And the moral lives of the conflict party falls under a subject that's called descriptive morality. That is, it's not the morality that we consider to be right or wrong, that is, we as witnesses or analysts. It's the morality that is lived in the experiences, thoughts, and actions of the parties themselves. It is what is the case regarding their lived experience of that reflects moral normative commitment. Again, a normative commitment could be based on their views of right or wrong action, good or bad conditions in life, and virtuous or vicious character traits. And of course, in many cases, understanding the moral lives of conflict parties is to understand the kind of deep wound that they experience and their reactions to that wound. Now, this then raises the question of our role as interveners. That is, what should be done? What is our task in this? And the conflict resolution practice is focused exactly on the attempt to transform the moral lives of conflict parties. This is a kind of treatment which represents an intervention in the way in which the parties are carrying out what I've called their moral life. That these are normative commitments on our part, that is, conflict resolution practitioners and scholar practitioners, that we are seeking a change in the way in which they, the conflict parties, intervene, changing how they behave in relation to each other, obviously, changing their thoughts, which attempt to minimize the polarity, the essentialism of thinking of this in-group, that they are so pure and the out-group is so degenerate, and also changing their emotions, as it were, basically changing their moral emotions. As I mentioned, reducing, for example, the fear, hopefully reducing the humiliation that they experience, and obviously reducing the reaction that they have. That these objectives of many conflict resolution techniques are driven by normative commitments. And in fact, we can say that all of the major topics in what's called conflict resolution practice have underpinning them value commitments to change the relationship among the conflict parties for what we believe is the better, change to improve, as it were, to establish the right relations among the conflict parties. This applies to peacekeeping, to peace building. Reconciliation is obviously strongly normative enterprise, and obviously a recognition of basic human rights. The whole field of human rights reflects a normative commitment about the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. So the techniques that we employ invariably, or most of the time, when especially techniques of intervention, we are seeking to engage, entice, empower the parties for positive change. That this is an attempt to promote, as it were, a virtuous relation, what we think is for the better. That is, the entire focus of many intervention techniques is on the kind of relationship among the conflict parties, and of course among those who are engulfed in the conflict, not only the direct activists or agents, but also those who are indirectly affected, such as civilians. And this is reflected in the two primary goals of our field that define our field. That is, peace itself, or bringing peace to a war-torn region, is itself a virtue that we prize. Peace is not defined as a matter of fact. Of course, some people may be living in peace, others may not be, but peace is a virtue that we privilege in the ethics that we hold, sometimes implicitly, but always important, that we hold and recommend for the parties. Similarly, the goal of redressing injustice is a virtue. It's the highest virtue that we hold in our field, and that we believe is, as it were, good for the conflict parties. And of course, this is an area that's called normative morality. In other words, when we're thinking about these value commitments, when we're engaging, when we're debating, when we're struggling with it, we're in an area of inquiry and activism that is called normative morality, which is the reasoned inquiry into the norms of right relations among individuals and among groups. We are particularly interested in the struggles of marginalized people, that we give special attention to the suffering, to the struggles, and to the vulnerabilities of those groups who are disenfranchised from society, who are vulnerable to many forms of abuse and, of course, damage to their lives. So by engaging in normative morality, it doesn't make us the high priests of the world. We have to avoid the attempt to make arbitrary decisions, and obviously we need to be mindful of the morality and the norms, the culturally based norms of the conflict parties themselves. So this creates a matter of inquiry. We have to figure this out. This is part of our challenge, as not to arbitrarily impose in a rigid and autocratic way our own value commitments on other societies. Nevertheless, our profession, like the profession of medicine, our profession is fundamentally a normative profession. Our field is normative, and the way in which we understand conflict parties reveals basically the moral lives of the participants and the parties. So I hope that is helpful, and thank you very much.